These are the harsh realities facing Charleston, South Carolina, a city that spent 12 consecutive years as America's #1 tourist destination, while simultaneously drowning in a catastrophic cycle of flooding and insurance costs that threatens to wash away its very foundation. Charleston held the coveted top spot in Travel Plus Leisure magazine's rankings for over a decade, earning $14.03 billion in tourism revenue in 2024 alone. 7.7 million visitors flocked to its cobblestone streets and antebellum mansions, spending an average of $1,105 each, drawn by the same postcard-perfect charm that has captivated travelers for generations. But that 12-year streak ended in 2025, when Charleston dropped to third place, losing to Santa Fe by just over a point, perhaps a symbolic shift reflecting growing recognition that postcard beauty alone is not enough when the postcard is slowly sinking underwater. Beneath this tourism success story lies a city literally sinking under the weight of rising seas, and financially drowning in insurance premiums that have more than doubled since the implementation of FEMA's Risk Rating 2.0 system. The numbers tell a stark story of contrast. Tourism employment reached 54,900 jobs and accounted for nearly a quarter of all sales in the Charleston area. But the city experienced 54 tidal floods in 2024, the 7th worst year on record for what locals euphemistically call sunny day flooding. These are not storm-related disasters. These floods happen on clear, calm days when king tides simply rise high enough to send seawater bubbling up through storm drains and flooding streets with knee-deep, bacteria-infested water that forces school children to wade through contaminated floods just to get home. To understand how we arrived at this precarious moment, we need to examine Charleston's unique geography and the decisions made over more than a century that created this perfect storm of beauty and vulnerability. Charleston's peninsula sits at an average elevation of just 8 feet above sea level, with a full third of all residential properties located on land that is 10 feet or less above the waterline. Here is what makes the situation even more precarious. At least 40% of the peninsula is not even natural land. It is landfill, marshes, and creeks stuffed with garbage, dredging materials, dirt, and sand during massive land reclamation projects between 1909 and 1919. As NOAA oceanographer William Sweet explains, as the water rises, a lot of the land sinks, because this artificial foundation simply cannot provide the stability that natural bedrock would offer. The city's vulnerability became tragically apparent during Hurricane Hugo in 1989. The Category 4 storm struck Sullivan's Island with 140 miles per hour winds and a 12-foot storm surge, producing the highest storm tide heights ever recorded along the U.S. East Coast. Hugo destroyed or damaged 10,000 homes and caused more than $3 billion in damages. Charleston was spared the worst impacts only because the storm's eye passed slightly north of the city. A track just a few miles further south would have been catastrophic for downtown Charleston. Hugo was just a preview of what was coming. Sea levels around Charleston have risen about 13 inches over the past century, but the rate of increase is accelerating rapidly. Scientists now project an additional 1.2 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and about 4 feet higher by the end of the century. That might not sound like much, but when you are starting from an average elevation of 8 feet, every inch matters enormously. The flooding statistics paint an increasingly dire picture. Charleston experienced 10 to 25 nuisance flooding events annually in the 1990s. Those numbers seemed manageable, an inconvenience rather than a crisis. But by recent years, the number of days per year when tidal flooding soaks the city regularly exceeds 80. Charleston experienced more tidal floods in 2024 alone than it did during the entire 37-year period from 1921 to 1958. For perspective, in 1924, the city experienced 0 tidal floods, 0. These are not just numbers on a chart. Real families deal with the consequences every day. In West Ashley, resident Nell Postel has developed what she calls a wet weather routine based on weather forecasts, because storms trigger sewage overflows so frequently into a pond near her home that she has to plan her life around predicted waste backups. When rain comes down in Charleston, Sewage literally comes up. Vehicles get stuck on flooded streets. Children wade through contaminated stormwater to reach their schools. The frequency is accelerating at an alarming pace. According to Charleston's recently released water plan, the city could experience as many as 170 flood events per year by 2050. That is roughly one flood every other day. Sea levels are now rising up to 1 inch every 2 years, mainly due to the sinking land phenomenon, and tidal flooding in some areas has increased 75% since 2000. This escalating flood crisis has triggered a parallel insurance crisis that is reshaping who can afford to live in Charleston. The roots of this crisis trace back to the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012, which set the stage for FEMA's new Risk Rating 2.0 system. Under this new methodology, implemented in October 2021 for new policies and April 2022 for renewals, the average cost of flood insurance in Charleston jumped from $852 to $1,575 annually, an 85% increase. But that's just the average. In high-risk areas near the Cooper River or Ashley River, properties in designated flood zones can pay between $800 and $2,000 annually for flood insurance alone, on top of standard homeowner insurance that averages $5,401 per year for a $300,000 dwelling policy. The insurance burden extends far beyond flood coverage. The combination of rising sea levels, increased storm frequency, and costly claims history has made Charleston one of the most expensive places in America to insure a home. Zip codes in coastal South Carolina now rank among those with the highest insurance non-renewal rates in the country, according to a Brookings Institution analysis. Insurance companies are simply walking away from the market, leaving homeowners scrambling to find coverage at any price. Modern flood risk assessment tools, like First Street Foundation's Flood Factor, now provide property-specific flood risk data that often reveals even higher risks than traditional FEMA flood insurance rate maps, further complicating insurance calculations. The human cost of this insurance spiral is profound. As United States senators noted in a 2025 letter, each month that Risk Rating 2.0 continues unchecked, more families are forced to abandon their insurance coverage, neighborhoods face economic strain, and entire communities risk collapse after the next disaster. This is not hyperbole. It is an accurate description of communities being slowly priced out of existence. Charleston's flood insurance. Claims history helps explain why rates have skyrocketed so dramatically. Since the city entered the National Flood Insurance Program in 1971, a total of 4,339 properties have made 6,607 flood insurance claims, resulting in over $117.3 million in claims payments over 50 years. $65.6 million of those payments, more than half the total, occurred in just the last 10 years, placing Charleston in the top tier nationally for flood damage. These statistics are not lost on insurance companies trying to calculate their risk exposure. The private insurance market has responded predictably. Cities like Charleston have seen private flood insurance take up rates triple over the past 5 years as homeowners desperately search for alternatives to the National Flood Insurance Program's escalating premiums. But private insurers are often even more expensive and restrictive, leaving many homeowners caught between unaffordable federal rates and inaccessible private markets. Faced with this mounting crisis, Charleston has embarked on an ambitious but controversial Seawall project that highlights the impossible choices facing coastal cities. The proposed battery extension is part of a larger $1.3 billion project designed to protect the historic peninsula from storm surge. Charleston's share amounts to approximately $455 million, with the federal government covering 65% of the total cost through the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The seawall represents both hope and profound inequity. Mayor William Cogswell has pushed aggressively for the project, securing $1.99 million in September 2024 to determine the precise positioning along the eastern peninsula. If approved and funded, construction could commence by 2035. The completed wall would protect the historic downtown core and its valuable tourism infrastructure, potentially saving billions in future flood damage. But the seawall's proposed perimeter reveals uncomfortable truths about who gets protected and who gets left behind. Working-class neighborhoods like Rosemont fall just beyond the wall's reach and will remain fully exposed to rising seas. Environmental justice advocates and the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities argue that the Corps of Engineers has not adequately considered how protecting affluent downtown areas might actually worsen flooding in excluded communities. Wave deflection from the seawall could increase flood impacts on neighborhoods west of the Ashley River or east of the Cooper River. Sea level rise projection maps show that some streets in Rosemont will likely be underwater by the end of the century, regardless of what happens downtown. The seawall essentially codifies a policy decision about which Charleston deserves protection: the historic, tourism-generating peninsula versus the residential neighborhoods where working families actually live. This represents a stark example of how climate adaptation can become a form of managed retreat by economic class, rather than by comprehensive planning. This tension between preservation and equity reflects deeper contradictions in Charleston's relationship with tourism itself. The same historic charm that attracts millions of visitors annually has made the city a victim of its own success. Brian Turner, president of the Preservation Society of Charleston, noted that while the latest Travel Plus leisure ranking validates Charleston's beauty and reputation as a welcoming place, a more important milestone would be when it becomes one of the best places to live, not just to stay. The proliferation of hotels and short-term rentals has reduced the stock of long-term housing and driven up prices for residents. Neighborhood-serving businesses are being pushed out by high-end shops and restaurants that cater to tourists rather than locals. The city faces a significant housing shortage precisely when market pressure for vacation accommodations is soaring. As tourism officials acknowledge, at a point the attention can strain our city and diminish the values that make it so unique. Charleston is not the first place to grapple with these challenges. The city was actually a pioneer in tourism management, adopting the nation's first local tourism management plan in 1978. Historic preservation efforts dating back to the 1920s were driven partly by tourism economics, but early preservationists quickly learned that over-tourism could have harmful consequences. When tourists began removing decorative elements from historic buildings as souvenirs, the Preservation Society pressed for stronger city oversight and adopted an informal motto that captures the tension: gut fish, not houses. The rapid development fueled by tourism success has created additional flooding vulnerabilities. Every new subdivision and strip mall replaces absorbent forests and wetlands with impervious surfaces, asphalt, rooftops, parking lots that send rainwater rushing into residential neighborhoods instead of soaking into the ground. The development boom is literally paving over the natural infrastructure that once provided flood protection. Current projections suggest Charleston's challenges will only intensify. The 1,000-year flood event that devastated South Carolina in 2015 demonstrated that extreme weather can strike at any time, regardless of statistical probabilities. Hurricane Matthew in 2016 sent water surging over Charleston's iconic Battery Wall. Tropical storm Idalia caused historic flooding in 2023. Each event provides a preview of what routine conditions might look like in coming decades. The National Flood Insurance Program itself faces an uncertain future. The program currently owes the U.S. Treasury $22.5 billion after borrowing to pay claims for a string of high-cost flooding disasters over the last decade. 10 states, including Florida, Texas, and Louisiana, have sued the federal government, claiming that FEMA's Risk Rating 2.0 methodology exceeds the agency's statutory authority. Charleston's experience illustrates how climate change intersects with economic inequality in coastal communities. The double impact of high storm risks and costly insurance is already reshaping housing markets in Virginia Beach, Wilmington, and Charleston itself. Properties that were once considered prime real estate are becoming financial liabilities as insurance costs approach or exceed mortgage payments. The low-battery Seawall project, with a $64 million price tag and targeted completion in 2025, provides a small-scale example of what is possible and what is not. This significant engineering achievement represents raising and reinforcing the existing barrier that protects Charleston's most iconic waterfront. But it also demonstrates the enormous costs involved. $64 million for just a small section of the peninsula's perimeter. Meanwhile, the clock keeps ticking. NOAA oceanographer William Sweet warns, decades of sea level rise are catching up. El Nino can make it worse, but La Nina does not necessarily make it better. The fundamental drivers of Charleston's crisis, rising seas, sinking land, and increasingly intense weather, are not going anywhere. Charleston's story represents a preview of challenges facing coastal cities across America. The combination of valuable historic assets, tourism-dependent economies, and accelerating climate impacts creates impossible choices between preservation and adaptation, between protecting existing communities and preparing for future realities. Charleston's future will likely depend on whether it can maintain its essential character while adapting to radically different physical and economic realities. The tourism revenue that built modern Charleston may need to fund a managed retreat from the very geography that made the city famous. The question is not whether Charleston will change, it is whether that change will be planned and equitable, or chaotic and devastating. For now, visitors still flock to Charleston's charming streets, spending $1,105 on average per trip, marveling at antebellum architecture and sampling world-class cuisine. But increasingly, those same streets flood on sunny days when king tides rise high enough to remind everyone that some forces are more powerful than marketing budgets or historic preservation ordinances. Charleston remains beautiful, welcoming, and utterly vulnerable, a postcard city learning to live with the reality that postcards cannot capture rising seas.